What makes a man in plain white robes one of the most powerful moral voices on earth? How does a single figure, without armies, without wealth, without the instruments of modern power, command the attention of presidents, prime ministers, and the forgotten poor? He walks through crowds with no fear. He speaks in whispers, and yet the world leans in to listen. He kneels where kings once stood. He challenges those who rule and comforts those who suffer. But there's something more. Because leadership like his isn't taught in business schools. It wasn't born in strategy rooms. It didn't rise through politics or fame. It came through something older. Something rarer. Something that feels almost lost in the noise of this age. Is it charisma? Is it humility? Or is it the quiet power of a soul unafraid to serve when others seek to reign? Because somewhere, deep beneath the robes and rituals, beyond the applause and the controversies, lies a truth the modern world still struggles to grasp. A truth about what it truly means to lead. Today, we trace the footsteps of a man who redefined what it means to lead. From the narrow streets of Buenos Aires to the grand columns of St. Peter's Square. From whispered prayers with prisoners, to bold speeches before world leaders. His journey has not followed the expected path. And neither has his leadership. He rejected power cloaked in gold. He chose the worn path over the polished stage. He became a shepherd, not of sheep, but of nations searching for meaning. In an era obsessed with dominance, influence, and visibility. He became the opposite. And in doing so, became unforgettable. Today, we uncover 5 timeless leadership secrets of Pope Francis. Lessons not just for popes or priests, but for CEOs. For parents. For teachers. For anyone called to lead with courage, humility, and vision. These are not strategies. They are convictions. Forged in silence. Proven in action. And stay with us, because at the end of this story, you'll witness the bold moment when Pope Francis said 5 words that stunned the world. And changed the conversation about leadership forever. Pope Francis embracing children, comforting the grieving, smiling with religious leaders. A young woman listening intently during a papal address. Slow montage of emotional faces from all walks of life watching him speak. Fade to black. A single phrase appears on screen, timed with a dramatic tone shift. Leadership, by example. Before the white robe. Before the millions chanted his name across the world. Before the Vatican balcony and the sea of waiting eyes. He was just Jorge. Jorge Mario Bergoglio. The son of an immigrant railway worker in Buenos Aires. The quiet boy who swept church floors. The teenager who cleaned lab equipment at night to pay for school. The young man who fell in love once, and let it go for something higher. He chose a life most would never understand. A life of vows, poverty, chastity, obedience. Not to escape the world, but to serve it more fully. As a Jesuit, he walked through the broken neighborhoods of Argentina. Not with sermons, but with sleeves rolled up. He listened to the angry. Sat with the addicted. Taught science by day. Offered confession by night. His leadership wasn't loud, but it was constant. He declined positions of power more than once. Not because he feared responsibility, but because he believed leadership was not a reward. It was a weight you carried for others. Then came 2013. A world reeling from scandal, division, and doubt turned its eyes once again to the Sistine Chapel. The smoke billowed. White. The moment that only comes once in a generation had arrived. And when the curtain opened, there was no towering figure in royal garb. No outstretched arms or dramatic declarations. Just a man. Plain, soft-spoken, bowing before the people, before he ever asked for their reverence. The world watched in silence, and then, a man stepped out, not with a crown, but with a bow. That was the moment the church knew. This would not be business as usual. He didn't claim greatness. He didn't need to. Because leadership secret number 1, lead with humility, not title. Power often hides behind gates. It rides in convoys, speaks through press releases, and dines behind curtains. But from the very first night of his papacy, Pope Francis broke that rhythm. When the papal car arrived to escort him back to his new quarters, he quietly declined and returned by bus. The papal apartment in the Apostolic Palace, spacious, adorned, private. He left it untouched. Instead, he chose a humble room in the Vatican guest house. No guards at the door. No golden furnishings. Just a desk, a cross, and a suitcase still unpacked. He refused the papal palace. Chose a guest house instead. Refused extravagance. Chose simplicity. Not for show, but because the heart of a shepherd must live among the sheep. His car, a used Ford Focus. His shoes, worn leather. His dinners, shared in the cafeteria, seated beside gardeners, cooks, and janitors. He paid his own hotel bill after his election, because, as he said, it was the right thing to do. But perhaps the most extraordinary acts were the quietest ones. A grieving mother receives a phone call. She thinks it's a prank. It isn't. It's the Pope, thanking her for her letter. Praying with her over the phone. A young man battling despair finds a voicemail on his mobile. Courage, the voice says. God walks with you. This wasn't public relations. It was a pattern. A conviction. That to lead, one must walk. Not above. Not ahead. But beside. He reminded the church, greatness isn't found in elevation, but incarnation. Because when a leader chooses presence over prestige, when he becomes accessible, he becomes unforgettable. Leadership secret number 2, walk among the people. Others drew lines. He built bridges. Between faiths. Between enemies. Between generations separated by wounds too deep for words. Pope Francis stepped into rooms many leaders feared. Not with a sword of opinion, but with the open hands of dialogue. He sat with rabbis. Shared meals with imams. Prayed beside Buddhists, Hindus, and atheists alike. He never changed who he was. But he never demanded others do so either. Because he believed that to lead, you must first listen. He called it fraternity. Not as a strategy, but as a sacred duty. In Syria, he pleaded for peace, his voice breaking through the silence of bombs. In Ukraine, he spoke of human dignity. Even when geopolitics begged him to stay silent. And when the world turned its eyes to the climate crisis, he didn't speak in scientific terms. He spoke as a steward. In Laudato Si, he addressed not just Catholics, but humanity. Calling for respect. For action. For the earth. For the poor. For the future. It wasn't always applauded. It wasn't always understood. But he kept speaking. And more importantly, he kept listening. He listened to the cries of the displaced. The whispers of the elderly. The silence of the planet. Because Pope Francis understood. Dialogue does not mean surrender. It means strength. And in an age of outrage and noise, he taught us that the strongest leaders are the ones who listen hardest. Leadership secret number 3, embrace the power of listening. Leaders speak from balconies. Others from behind locked doors. But Francis chose to speak from the dirt. On Holy Thursday, when tradition called for the washing of feet, he entered a prison. Not a cathedral. He knelt before inmates, young and old, Christian and Muslim, guilty and broken. And with no cameras staged, no glory to gain. He washed their feet. Each one. No titles. No judgments. Only water, silence, and grace. Because leadership, he believed, was not the power to stand above, but the willingness to go low. When the world closed its borders, he walked into refugee camps. Children without shoes. Mothers without nations. He didn't just visit. He embraced. He kissed heads no one had touched in weeks. He wept where politicians only spoke. And when reporters asked why, he answered simply, because they are human. But his compassion was not passive. It had fire. He spoke boldly of economic injustice. Not in vague terms, but with names, systems, structures. He called out indifference. He named greed for what it was. And when powerful institutions bristled, he did not flinch. He wasn't trying to win favor. He wasn't chasing applause. He was defending the voiceless. Even when it made him a target. Because Francis understood something vital. Peace without justice is illusion. And silence, when people are suffering, is not neutrality. It is betrayal. He knelt where kings would not. He spoke where silence was safer. He chose the places others avoided. He raised the names others erased. And in doing so, he reminded the world that moral courage often looks like compassion in action. Leadership secret number 4, defend the voiceless, even when it's unpopular. Institutions often resist change. The older they are, the more they creak when shifted. And few are older than the Vatican. But Pope Francis stepped into its marble corridors with a quiet fire in his eyes. He didn't make announcements with thunder. He made reforms with resolve. He simplified bureaucracy, untangled protocols, and called for transparency in places long untouched. And he did it without spectacle. Because real visionaries don't shout, they steer. When Evangelii Gaudium was released, it wasn't just another papal document. It was a manifesto of joy. A cry for the Church to stop obsessing over rules. And start overflowing with mercy. He asked a radical question. Why are we afraid of happiness? He warned against spiritual coldness. He called for a church that heals, that embraces. That doesn't stand at the door judging, but runs out to meet the wounded on the road. He believed the gospel wasn't a weapon. It was a lifeline. And while others ruled through fear, he led with joy. He told priests to carry the smell of their sheep. He told bishops to come down from thrones. He told all of us, Catholic or not, that faith without mercy is noise. He stood before a world drowning in outrage. And he didn't argue. He didn't match the volume. He offered something the world had almost forgotten. Tenderness. Joy. Forgiveness. In a world drowning in outrage, he offered compassion as resistance. And in a time where power often hides behind anger, he reminded us that mercy is might. Because vision is not about looking forward with certainty. It's about walking forward with courage. Even when the road is unclear. Even when you're alone. Leadership secret number 5, lead with mercy, not fear. It happened mid-flight. No script. No press release. Just a question from a journalist. And 5 words that shook the world. Who am I to judge? 5 words. Spoken not in defiance, but in courage. The question was about inclusion. About people whose place in the church had long been debated, dismissed, even condemned. And in a moment where so many expected condemnation, he offered something different. Not a policy. Not a loophole. But a pause. An invitation to see the person, before the label. Global news headlines racing across the screen, anchors debating, applause in some corners, backlash in others. Some smile. Others scowl. And Francis remained still. The response came fast. Applause from those who saw hope. Outrage from those who saw heresy. Articles. Statements. Heated panels. But Francis didn't flinch. He didn't retract. He didn't clarify to soften the edge. Because it wasn't about politics. It wasn't about popularity. It was about presence. And real leadership. The kind that stirs the waters of comfort. Doesn't seek safety. It steps into storms with open arms. Knowing full well that to love boldly is to be misunderstood deeply. Leadership means facing storms with open arms. In that moment, he wasn't redefining doctrine. He was redefining leadership. Not as authority over others, but responsibility for them. You don't need a robe. You don't need a ring. You don't need a throne. Leadership was never about titles. It's about presence. It's about choosing to show up, when no one is watching. A nurse gently holding the hand of a patient in pain. A teacher leaning beside a struggling student, whispering words of encouragement. A young man helping an elderly woman cross a busy street, no camera in sight. You lead when you choose kindness in a cruel moment. You lead when you listen, when it would be easier to speak. You lead when you protect the vulnerable, speak truth in silence. And stand for compassion when the world rewards cruelty. The legacy of Pope Francis isn't reserved for cardinals or councils. It's meant for every person with a soul stirred by justice. A heart moved by mercy. And a desire to make the world just a little more human. You lead when you lower yourself. Not because you are weak. But because love, real love, always bends down first. You only need the courage to serve. The humility to listen. The heart to lead. So ask yourself. Where are you being called to lead, today? Not someday. Not if you're chosen. But now. Exactly where you stand. Which of Pope Francis' leadership secrets spoke to you the most? Was it his humility? His mercy? His unwavering courage to serve the forgotten? Tell us. Not just what moved you, but where you feel called to lead. Share this story with someone who needs to lead with love. There are people out there, right now, waiting to be reminded that love is still leadership. That compassion still changes things. And if this story stirred something in you, then subscribe. Because the world has forgotten many of its greatest leaders. But we remember. Discover the leaders who changed the world, by serving it.